Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. Nepal Conversations is a podcast series where we talk to scholars and researchers about their interesting work on various aspects of Nepali society. We're very pleased to present Series 4 of Nepal Conversations podcast on the theme of erasures. This series is presented jointly by International Research Project Heritage as Placemaking and Nepal Conversations.
In this fourth episode of the Erasure series, we're pleased to present our conversation with Dr. Christoph Emmrich. Christoph Emmrich is Associate Professor at the University of Toronto, Canada. His work engages with fields as diverse as Nepalese and Burmese Buddhist, Sanskrit, Pali, Newar, Burmese and Mon literature, and Tamil Jainism. His recent research includes the theme of girl children, young women, and ritual specialists among the Newar in the Kathmandu Valley. In today's conversation, we will talk about his recent work on lists of things that are required for rites amongst Newar Buddhists and Hindus in the Kathmandu Valley.
Welcome to Nepal Conversations, Christoph. It's really wonderful to have you in this podcast series. You have done extensive work on ritual events, ritual specialists, and ritual practices, and now you're moving on to researching the thing that's used before the actual ritual event, the lists that are prepared before the ritual to deal with all the material that is required to perform this event. Tell us a bit more about these lists. How did you get interested in them, and what are they, and why are they so important?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Uma, and thank you, Stephanie, for inviting me to be here with you. This is a great pleasure and a great honor to talk to you and to talk to all the listeners. Yes. To your question, I have been working for a while now on ritual manuals, books, usually in manuscript form, which priests use to record, prescribe certain rituals to refer to when performing them, when preparing them. I've been working on a range of rituals, particularly focusing on rituals dealing with girl children, children more generally, and rituals through these manuals reaching back in time, many centuries, as a record of how these rituals were prescribed, thought of, described, and right up to the present moment where I looked at both at the manuals and at events I then could access. Now, what made me be interested in or move on from that interest was that at the end of these manuals, you had a page or several pages with lists of implements, of materials used for these rituals. And as you point out, Uma, what I was interested in finding out more about what happens before the actual charismatic event, so to speak, of the heightened ritual where everything's supposed to be there and has to work, and for which these materials have to be provided. So to look at also in some way at the serving, the instrumental function of the list, which then would lead me into that space, into that place, into that time before the ritual itself, how the ritual is prepared and worked towards. What I found particularly interesting is already the ritual manual is a text which does not stand on its own. It's deeply ingrained with what it's supposed to produce, the event, or what it's supposed to remember, commemorate, or describe. So it's a text where you feel both the limitation of the text, because it just refers to something out there bigger and more important than itself, which it helps to produce. But it also is a trace of something which is lost, an event which happened and just is no longer. And this manual reminds us of how past events were supposed to look like. Now the list in a way does that even more, I find, because the list is something which not just the priest has in his manual, which he consults, but which he actually hands on to the people who are in charge of the event, who are preparing the event, to the women very often, most of the time, of households which are preparing that, households preparing, organizing that event, and the women who then have to make sure that the implements, the objects are all there. Now, what I find interesting about lists, that there are so much about remembering. I mean, remembering what to bring to the event, but they're also about forgetting. I mean, they're about making sure you don't forget to bring to the event. So they're both about remembering and forgetting, and we might talk about that a bit further on, because it's the in some way the theme of this podcast series, erasure. They're as much about erasure as they're about recovery, and about loss, and compensating and resisting erasure, the erasure of forgetting something and of not being able to make that happen what's supposed to be happening.
Thank you very much. And directly into memorialization, that's fantastic. Are these lists always written, or should they ideally be memorized? Does memorizing, for example, allow for a different kind of memory palace that connects those who organize the ritual closer to it? Or is sitting down with your priest or your grandmother to write a shopping list part of the generational knowledge transfer? And thus, is the speaking about ritual items an important process, and the outcome of the ephemeral shopping list no more than a disposable item?
Yes, I think these are fantastic thoughts. I would very much agree with the direction in which you're asking. I would say that the list, of course, one has to be clear about what does one mean when one talks about the list. And coming from the ritual manual, I was starting. I've been starting with the written list. So with either a list of a series of words denoting things or quantities, which need to be provided, written down on a piece of paper in a manuscript. But I believe that is in some way only the trace or an important part of a larger process, which is a process of communication and of exchange about what to do in a certain event. And so the list, in some way, the written list, is a condensation of sorts of a larger conversation, the conversation between exactly the priest and the people organizing the event, but then also a conversation between the people organizing the event, writing down a list, taking it to the shop, and talking to the shopkeeper about what is there, what he can provide. And then have a conversation again about the list, about the written down list. So in some way, yes, I think the written list is in some way a mediator of different kinds of conversation, which then also happen. And the most important, I think, conversation is the one you're referring to, is that between generations at home. And very often, again, a conversation among women. But as you see, it is also a conversation between women and the priest, the male priest, and the very often male shopkeeper, not necessarily male. But it's also, the list is always gendered, and it's always intergenerational, and it's always across asymmetries of power, of ritual authority, of control of the commodities, of control and controlled handing down of memory and family traditions from the senior-most woman to the junior women, but then also instructions of take this, we need to get this stuff, again formulated in an asymmetrical power relationship. You go and provide these things, and you use the list for that. So yes, I would say it has to do. Lists are very much connected to voice and to the embodiment of the list in a person's memory, in a person's body, and it's about interface and facing the other, and it's about lineage, and it's about and I would say that the paper list is the trace of all this in a way. On the one hand, on the other hand, it's also the catalyst, the basis around which these conversations take place.
Thank you. As you mentioned, there are many people involved in this process. And what happens when there are different lists which are competing for attention and authentication? There are senior peoples in the household, priests, astrologers, shopkeepers. What happens when they disagree? And under what conditions can these items be replaced or removed from these lists? Are there some items that are permanently erased and never make it to the future lists?
Yes, that's a really important point. And if I may, I mean, this might be an opportunity to speak to the larger issue of erasure, which you address here. Absolutely. I mean, in some way, building on what I've just mentioned about lists being in some way the discussion, the conversation piece of exchanges, they're very often also catalysts of conflict and of disagreement. And I think that's in some way one of the main functions of the list is that they show us, that they give us the opportunity to disagree and to say, well, there's something missing, we need to add something else, or there's this, we don't need this, we should take this off the list. So in all these moments in which the list passes basically from one to the other, or is actually even drawn out, because on the one hand we have lists which are written down in ritual manuals, which the priest produces when he's consulted to prepare the ritual. But then there are also lists, I mean, events where the priest is not consulted, where it's just a question of the senior-most woman in the household running things. And there you have a moment of contestation. So what do we need for this? And then you have a whole range of people and of women participating in the discussion, what needs to come on the list to create the list in the first place, but an oral list, right? So yes, it is about definitely the pressure that the event has to take place, and we have to make sure that that event takes place. And for the larger good of that event, negotiations are conducted. What the point you bring up, which is really important, is are things left out or added on? So, and what's the element of erasure there? I think that's important. I would not say that I've seen too much of that in terms of lists dramatically changing. These are usually they're about details. I can think of one, not in the rituals I've been looking at, but for example, conversations about whether to include animal sacrifice in a ritual, right? That of course impacts a ritual list dramatically when you have to replace or out, one item, so to speak, say meat, with another one, which is vegetable. So those would be important points to look at lists, what changes in time, at which point, and what substitutions are possible. Now, the thing is that erasure and substitution go hand in hand in a way. Because there is an old ritual tradition of also recorded in priestly literature that you can exchange and you can replace things. So if you don't have A, you can use B. If you don't have B, you can use C. And then there's an option, even if you don't have C, use anything. So inclusion and substitution and erasure substitution might be really important. I think it's an important issue. But then I think there are more issues, and I could maybe mention just a few in terms of erasure. I mean, erasure a list is important because you cross off things, right? You check and then you throw out. So whatever you've provided can be erased from the list. So the list is actually a method for erasure, right? Erasing what you do not have to remember anymore because you already have remembered it or provided it. The other thing is that the lists themselves are subject to erasure. Lists are ephemeral objects or texts, I should say. They are made, they are jotted down. One goes shopping, and then one shops and has everything, or comes back, checks what one has, and once the ritual event has happened, you don't need that list; it goes. So these are very precious items because they are really, they are meant to be thrown in a way, part if they're recorded in ritual manuals and become really normative. But the real list, the pragmatic list, is gone. So there's an erasure of the list, if you so will. But then the last point about erasure, which I think is important about lists, that writing it down itself could be seen as a form of erasure. That the writing and the textualization of the list is in some way erasing the autonomy and the power of memory which is not written, right? So I think I believe there's a conflict between the list as remembering something, as preserving something, and the list as actually erasing a living oral memory which is there. I'm not saying that is happening, that the written list makes people forget, but what one writes down in order to be able to forget. No, I think was it Mark Twain who said that. So that's what the list does. It is part of a form of at least a conflict of possible erasure of the oral, of that which can be remembered without having to write it down.
Fantastic. This is really interesting. Can I take you just back to this ephemerality of the list? Do people sometimes keep handwritten lists a bit like love letters as a keepsake because they express love and care and remind you of the person who wrote the list? And then that kind of brings us to the next question, really. What kind of emotions are attached to these lists? Those who buy the ritual items, who would, without a list, have to go back and forth between the shop, priest, astrologer, mother-in-law, the household elders to get the forgotten items. I mean, do people cry over lists that cannot be fulfilled?
Yes, thank you for bringing up this the effective side of lists. I think that's very, very important. Now, to your first point, does anyone retain lists as like a love letter? I mean, that's a beautiful thought. We have to look out for that. Usually, lists that are retained are those really normative ones, right? The ones you find in manuals, or you find maybe in very well organized, say priestly run shops, where the priest himself is a shopkeeper and he has that list, not necessarily the ritual manual list, but just like a list in terms of an inventory, but also to tell people, well, this is actually what you need. Keeping a list as a token, I don't know. That would be another archive to be looked out for. But I think what you're addressing here is something really important, though. Because you can have a love letter and still throw it, right, or lose it. I think there is a difference between, and that's a list scholar Robert Belknap has brought that up, or introduced that distinction between the pragmatic list and the poetic list. And in the poetic list, that's where emotion becomes important. The pragmatic list is there. Let's make sure everything's taken care of. Let's make sure all the guests have been invited whom we want to invite. The poetic list is something more. It can be a pragmatic list, which is read poetically in terms of, oh, I see. Well, we're now preparing our daughter's marriage to the Belfruit, which is a coming of age rite of the Newars. And you look at that list, and I've had conversations with women about lists where they looked at them and then said, oh, our daughter's really growing up and she's going to do this thing. And after that, she'll be someone else. And so you have that's one I think would be a strong testimony to the poetic, the creative side of the list, which is not just organizing stuff or getting things done in a complete and perfect fashion. So yes, a lot of that. I would also say, and we can talk about that maybe later. But the fact that you imagine the imagination the list allows for or produces, that you imagine that event to happen. So it's not just necessarily about your daughter or your niece or your granddaughter, but the emotion and the affective state, the imagination of a successful event, the happiness, and also then I would say the anxiety, a hopefully successful event that will be brought about by working on this list. So yes, a lot of that. I would also say a lot of the affective side of the list is also that it carries so much responsibility, or at least that the person who wields the list and who handles it and who has to go and get the stuff in some way, even at any point in which the list is drawn or worked on, there is the pressure, let's get this right. And will I get it right? And there's contestation. You did not get it right. You did not get the following item when the shopper comes back from the market or from the shop, and then has to go back. So there's a lot of, and also then there's agreement, say, between the shopper and the seller. Is this the right thing? Well, we only have that. Well, will that do? Is the shopkeeper charging me too much? So the whole emotion of first of all, in some way, the whole emotion of control and failure is, I think, really, really important, connected to the list. In some way, the list wants to do both. The list wants to reassure, but it's also the cause for anxiety and worry. And I think it's a constant circle. The more control you have through the list, the more there's the possibility that your failure can be recorded and be determined. So in some way, that which is supposed to reassure you, the list, which is supposed to remind you of everything, can also be the list which then reminds you that you actually have forgotten. And so yes, I think it has both powers, the list, and a whole world of the affective built around it.
That's wonderful. Just to follow up on this, you mentioned that how these lists produce a variety of feelings and also carries these responsibilities, a lot of responsibilities. How do these lists assert the expertise of their author? For example, if a priest is not able to produce an extensive list, does it damage his reputation as a knowledgeable person? And similarly, if other priests become unpopular because their lists are too demanding and impractical, what kind of impact does it have in terms of the way the authors of the lists are evaluated in terms of what kind of list that they are able to produce?
Yes. I think this is a really, really crucial question in understanding how lists work. I would try to answer your question by asking the question: who owns a list? And authorship, in some way, would be one way of owning it, of claiming the ownership of the list. I think it's also a question of how much is this an issue of what is inside the list, what is the content of the list, which is what you're referring to. If something is left out or not put in, is included, is the authorship, is the authority of the author questioned? So that's one thing to look at. Does who owns the list depend on what's put into the list? But one could also move out and say, is it about how one handles the list as a whole, which is there, independently of what's inside of it or not. So the question is how. So the question would be, because this list moves from hand to hand, it moves from the priest's hand into the, say, the household, into the woman's hand, and maybe then to the senior woman's hand, who was interacting with the priest, to the junior woman who's then sent out to get the stuff, into the hands of the shopkeeper. And I think at all these conjunctures, all these passages, all these transfers of the list, there's a new process of negotiating who has the authority to interpret the list in the right way, in the way which serves the purpose of getting the event done, which whoever is part of it wants to see happen. So I think it's really a question also in some way of it's almost a political question of the sovereignty of the interpreter. And there I think that's where what you say comes in. If at some point someone says, well, but there's something missing here. So in some way there is a list out there, which is in some way the ideal list, which is then held against the list which is being written down, which then may need translation, which may needs addition and editing. So I think in a way we have different authorities here, and the author of the list is one authority, which has to compete in some way with the authority of the person in charge at home, the senior-most woman, who decides whether this list is complete. And finally, then with the authority of the shopkeeper who says, well, we don't have this, or no, actually that shouldn't be on the list, or well, this is wrongly written. Very often you then have a conversation between these different nodes, so to speak. In the case, for example, when the shopkeeper has the phone number of the priest, of the author, so to speak, and then can call him and ask him, so what did you mean by handing this on to the family, and so on. Authorship is also, in some way, a tricky one. Could also question that or break that up. Authorship, of course, is, and I like the idea that actually there are many authors here, and they're all working on this larger text, so to speak. And the priest is in some way someone who only, in square crows, hands on a list which he received from his father, and his father from his father. So author only to a certain point, right? More someone who's handing on, just as in some way the shopper is handing on to the shopkeeper, and he then back to the shopper once she's supposed to pay.
What kind of changes have you seen in these lists over time? I mean, if you look at it as a ritual shopping basket over time, are lists in the archive different from those that you have encountered? Are lists that you've seen earlier different from the ones that you've seen later? Do lists reflect actually something like an economic condition of families? A bit like the CPI, the consumer price inflation basket used in the UK?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a very important observation. Well, first of all, a straight answer to your question: yes, absolutely. So there's absolutely a difference between, say, people who are better off and those who are less well off. So and I would say there is a huge range between the list for an event which can only happen under certain economic conditions, which are limited on the one hand, and a list of a well-off family who can just afford more, right? So there would definitely be more things on the list. There might be the event may be bigger, so the quantities specified on the list would be larger, for example. That's one thing. I mean, actual economic affordance is an important factor. The other factor, I think, which is important, is the ideology which of the list, which and the ideology of ritual, if you could say. I mean, the idea that a ritual should be ostentatious, or versus the idea, no, the ritual should be economizing. And these are conversations which are probably have been important through the ages, but in modernity, this has become, I think, particularly crucial in say religious reform movements, which have and also movements of ethnic corporatization, if you so will, of say creating rituals in which not individual families run the show, but which families come together. And the rituals are organized by associations. And usually there the argument is, if we do that together, if the association takes care of it, we can reduce prices, we can control the fact that it that just doesn't get out of hand, becomes too crazy, and that there's a certain equality of the participants. And on the whole, yes, that it can be economized, versus individual events which are then also done for economic, for political purposes, to represent the greatness and the economic power of a family. Yes, those lists look very different, and I think it is, and their lists, I think, are fascinating to get that snapshot if one is able to get hold of these handwritten lists. Right? That would be, of course, the point. We're not talking about the ritual manual lists, which I think they follow other rules, and they don't give so much, an idea of an actual family, of an individual family. They give an idea of what the priest expects, basically, any family he is servicing to produce. So the negotiation then from the priestly list, while it moves into the household, that's the point where these differences emerge. And if one is lucky enough to be there when such lists are drawn, or to have a peep at such lists, that's a real insight into the social and economic history of ritual culture.
Following on this theme of changes, do you think these lists also, the role of this list are also changing as more forms of documentation are emerging with social and print media? So what does it mean to have a visual list, for example, on Facebook or Instagram, or something that you could scroll on your phone to see the picture of the items on display from the last time the ritual was performed? Does that change the function and the role of the list?
Yes, yeah, that. This is, of course, very important to follow. I would say that the written down, jotted down paper post-it kind of list is still the most ubiquitous at this point. What I've been seeing is lists on cell phones, but which would still be very much following the pattern of the format of the list on a scrap of paper. So you would have basically itemized one above the other the required materials, and they would then be that the phone would be shown to the shopkeeper, who would be then taking his hand the phone and then going through the list there. So in some way, again, that would be something there. The list would be drawn at home, again typed, and then handed on. What also happens there is that lists can be sent, right? That the priest would type that list, send it out to the contact person in the family, and then they would be working with that electronic document. So that's very much happening these days. It's been happening for a while, actually. What you have in terms of conversations about specific objects, that is something, and the use of images, that is something which is happening. I'm not seeing it. I mean, that pervasively, but occasionally. So, for example, if a priest, if the person who would go to shop would go to interact with the shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper would show her something which he would be offering, she may go and search for an image for something she'd be looking for, or she thinks she may be looking for, or she thinks her the senior woman in the family may have been looking for, and show her that. To show him that, rather, to the shopkeeper, or her, the shopkeeper, the woman shopkeeper, and have a discussion on that. I don't see that happening a lot, but I also don't see anything in terms of replacement there and necessarily erasure. What I see there is more accumulation and more options of referring, and in some way a stronger indication, again, that there is this list out there which is in people's voices and heads and in their communication, and whatever is possible to whatever helps that communication is good, can be brought in, both in terms of remembering and not forgetting the completeness of the list, and in terms of exchanging. But which object exactly, which material exactly were you talking about right now?
Yeah, thank you. We talked about different roles of these lists, but these lists that you mentioned usually also belong to a very specific ethnicity or specific religious activity or religious groups. In the current political context of Nepal, do you see these lists playing a more political role in the assertion of distinct identity or claiming of public space?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think thinking about the political role of the list is absolutely crucial, and I think there are several ways one could look at how the list is political. I mean, the first one, I mean, the one I was referring to earlier, is the question: who owns the list, right? Whose is the list, and who has sovereignty over the list? Who has the authority to interpret the list? So that's a political, the politics of the claims onto that, well, both imagined list and then the concrete list between the politics basically between within the family, say, but the politics between family and priest and or shopkeeper. That's one, I think, political side of the list. The second is the list as, and that's I think what you're referring to, the list basically as an inventory of material embodiment of identity. So that the list is in some way creates a community, but a community which is not imagined, but which is basically demanded, which is claimed, which is put together. And I'm thinking here of not so much of the individual items on the list. Say, I mean, just thinking of the list of the for the ritual I've been working on, which is this coming of age ritual for girl children, the ihi. The marriage to the bilva fruit, where you have a list which goes, say, bilva fruit, bowl, string, paper crown, sari, areca nuts. And none of these items in themselves have necessarily a valence which is exclusive to one ethnic group or identity. However, to bring them together as a list, that's when they spell identity. Because if they put them all together, and if, say, someone were to come with this list to a shopkeeper, the shopkeeper knows exactly whether he is from the same community or not, which community that person, the shopper, is coming from, that it's the Newar community. And so it's important to say there's not so much, I would say, a fetishization of individual items on that list which represent identity, but it's the very list, the very putting together of items, the combination of them, the relationship between them, that is the assemblage, if one wants to use that word, which creates the identity of the project this person is articulating, and is meant to and the kind of identity that project and that event is then eventually made to represent. I would like to add a third aspect, a political aspect of the list, which I think is important, because if you think of it, the list itself as a term is a very political word, and it's a very political thing. I mean, you think of lists of candidates, of nominees, of ministers, say, for example, but then you also think of the blacklist, right, as the list of people who need to be erased in a way. So a list of names here. So all terms which come from the political domain. I'm also thinking of lists of names to be commemorated, of people to be commemorated, basically to list peoples, communities, individuals who need not to be forgotten, and when they want lists in order to undo erasure, for example, which is a highly political act. But I would also add the list of demands, right? So the list, which is not just list of peoples, but list of demands, which is a political act. We demand the following things, and then you have a list of things of demand. So in some way, again, the list as a political tool goes far beyond the ritual sphere here. And in the other, and reversely, I think the list as a political tool is very much part of the ritual sphere. And I'm thinking here of the fact that Shami, you asked before about the poetic side of a list. That the list can be pragmatic, it can be poetic. I mean, it can evoke all these creative imaginations and feelings. But in being both, it's also political. So in some way, it is neither only pragmatic and only poetic, but I think also in all these ways, which I just pointed out, political, also in a way that these lists in some way also there's a certain suspicion built into the list against being merely pragmatic and merely poetic, against being merely we're going to assemble things to get something done, and to be merely it's about creating this inner or this outer emotional world. I think they are also actively about making sure that that one resists the erasing character of the list, and that it's about a project which needs to be fulfilled, which needs to change change the life of the individuals participating in the making of the event, and of the community as well.
Thank you so much for giving us this whole range of ideas about the lists. And now we understand that lists say a lot about the people who shop. But let's move to you. How did your own positionality as a white, male, middle-aged Sanskritist who is researching rituals, and also their object lists, impact onto your interlocutors, their answers, and the gathered data?
Yes, thank you. Very, very important question, and one I've been carrying with me from the very beginning, from the very first day in which I even considered working on in this field. I'd like to actually continue or connect it to the last point of the political point, that I see me being part of these conversations as a project which is larger than myself and larger than my own research project. That it is about being allowed to be part of a larger movement and of a history and of a struggle and of an engagement with things, with events, with among communities, which is historically so much larger than say either my own or even rather than my own project, or even larger than the say the ideological project of white people coming to Nepal to study this. My attitude is, the position I try to find, and I'm not, and I try to relativize that in terms of knowing that I'm still on my way and still finding my path here. That I'm there to listen. That I'm not there to tell people how they should see things or how they should understand things better, but it's me there who from my very small little perspective is to be curious and to want to know from them, instead of wanting to hear my own voice, but then also to see myself in the political role of allowing those voices to keep talking. I mean, I wouldn't pretend to think that I'm actually giving them that space or making it at all possible. I think they've been speaking loud and clearly, the people I work with there, for a very long time, and one needs to listen, and I think my listening is part of the kind of allyship I would like to, in an ideal case, to offer and to be engaging in, to support the agendas and the aspirations of the people I work with, and maybe to have a role in their way of reflecting about themselves, but more of a role as someone who just happens to be there and who wants to prioritize the agency and the voices of those who are actually concerned and who are primarily affected by the conditions in the country where I'm only a guest and a passing, a very privileged visitor. That would be my first answer, quick answer to a very large and very important question. I should of course should add that I'm coming with a baggage, which is not to say that I'm victim of that baggage. I want to say that I'm coming with baggage which is complicated and which needs to be removed in order not to be in the way of the people doing whom I'm interested in and whom I want to be an ally of, to do the things they want to do.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a wonderful conversation. We could go on, but we'll have to bring this really interesting conversation to an end. So thank you so much for sharing your insights into this very fantastic world of these ritual lists. And thank you really for your time, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Uma. Thank you, Stephanie. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for a marvelous array of questions, which made me think so much.
Commissioned music for this podcast has been produced by Vayu Audio Studios. Composer, music arrangement, guitar, tuna, sound mix and master, Vayu. Madal Dime Damaha and percussion Kunal Singh, bamboo flute Anish Maharjan, recorder Jaco, bass guitar BK, cello Celso.